Hello, my name is Maximilian, and this is a feminist approach to Tibetan Buddhism. Buddhism is a polytheistic religion that follows Buddha and his teachings, which referred to as the Dharma. A community of Buddhists is commonly referred to as the Sangha. Together, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha are commonly known as the Three Jewels or the Three Refugees. Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana are the three main sects of Buddhism. The Theravada is the oldest and has a strong emphasis on monastic community, followed 500 years later by the Mahayana. Lastly was the Vajrayana, which arguably has the quickest way to enlightenment and incorporates both the Theravada and Mahayana teachings. Tibetan Buddhism follows the Vajrayana teachings, which allows any person to follow the Lamrim to reach enlightenment. This type of Buddhism also believes in multiple Buddhas and not just the historical Buddha. Still, Tibetan Buddhism is a small sect of Vajrayana and revolves more around a combination of different Buddhisms, including the teachings of the Mahayana. Buddhism became a major presence in Tibet towards the end of the 8th century and was brought from India at the invitation of the Tibetan king Trisong Detsen. He brought two Buddhist masters to Tibet and had important Buddhist texts translated to Tibetan, thus starting this religion in Tibet. First to come was the Shantarakshita, abbot of Nalanda in India, who built the first monastery in Tibet. It only grew after the Mongols adopted their own version of Buddhism, and then finally spread to the West in recent history after being shunned by communist China. Tibetan Buddhism has become popularized due to the gain of the Dalai Lama after he was banished by the Chinese government. It is also important to acknowledge that there are subsections to Tibetan Buddhism that practice slightly different teachings, and it should be noted that the Dalai Lama was part of the Gelug. Although Buddhism has had a rich history of practicing an awakened type of life, the question I offer is how has the Tibetan Buddhism treated women throughout history, and how has this helped shape what Buddhism represents today? In Tibetan Buddhism, the highest incarnation is the Dalai Lama, then the Panchen Lama, and thirdly the Samding Dorje Phagmo. The Dalai Lama is the spiritual head of Tibetan Buddhism, and, until the establishment of the Chinese communist rule, the spiritual and temporal ruler of Tibet. The Panchen Lama is currently in a bit of a controversy due to the relations between Tibet and China, but the Panchen usually works closely with the Dalai Lama in both political and social issues. Lastly is the Samding Dorje. This is, as of now, the highest position of Buddhist power ever held by a woman and is a representation of how women are not subject to as much persecution as other religions. Still, they only come third in place to men. That being said, it is still important to acknowledge that men, as of now, have always superseded the rights of women in Tibetan Buddhism, and no matter how much power women are allowed to have, it will never be equal to men based off of history. This, however, is an issue I would argue is in most major religions, and since men have dominated the teachings of Buddhism, any feminist approach that has been passed down is usually done so by a man since most teachers are male. The first significant woman in traditional Buddhism was the stepmother and maternal aunt of the Buddha. In this Buddhist tradition, she was the first woman to seek ordination for women, which she did from Buddha directly, as she became the first bhikkhuni, or Buddhist nun. Although Tibetan Buddhism might seem slightly outdated under a certain light by today's standards, when this was first starting to take shape, women in Asia were generally not treated as fairly as they are today, so it was kind of a big deal that women could not only reach enlightenment, but also become a teacher over man so long as it pertained to becoming enlightened. Sadly, most documents from Buddhism that have been preserved were usually those that had more androcentric values. This led to stories that applied to women to be ignored severely throughout history, which continued in Western society. This mentality continues today, and although women are present, they have not been given the proper platform to grow. The idea of this is highlighted by Rita Gross's quadruple androcentrism, a spectrum of beliefs ranging from outright misogyny to total acceptance of women's spiritual capabilities exists side by side in Buddhist texts. Upon discovering a more accurate path, one in which women are included, it becomes evident that women have served substantial and diverse functions in Buddhist paths, and the treatment of women in male-dominated Buddhist society was often inappropriate. The improper treatment of women was not and is not consistent with Buddhist ideals, yet exists as if it were. The difference comes in the form of the 8 Garudamas, or heavy rules, and are additional rules for Buddhist nuns, which are supposed to allow more acceptance of a monastic order for women. They are controversial because they push women into an inferior role and because many Buddhists have found evidence that the Eight Heavy Rules are not really the teachings of Buddha. Although Buddhism has changed over time to better fit new ways of thinking, the roots that gave birth to what we know as Buddhism have stayed the same and has kept the idea of a quasi-genderless ideology that does not concern itself with such hollow labels so long as you are a man. Women in Tibet have come under countless hardships due to the Chinese government, which has been reintroducing outdated gender roles and general class bias. There is also patriarchal practices and countless gender roles in societal Tibet that also play a major part in creating an unbalanced platform for men and the belief and practices of Buddhist women are constantly transforming in order to face constantly changing social, economic, and political conditions. So I've come to the conclusion that so long as we stay on the path of enlightenment while allowing equal opportunity, Tibetan Buddhism, although patriarchal by nature, is moving in more or less the right direction. Since women's role in Buddhism has become acknowledged and challenged over the recent years, I think the next step is to challenge how we, the West, view Buddhism in relation to how women are treated. I believe that there is much to be gained by allowing women equal opportunity to their counterpart and hope that Buddhist beliefs become better adopted for all so we can all have the opportunity to properly reach enlightenment. Thank you.